I stood in the crowded living room holding a paper plate, surrounded by family members I'd known my entire life. The noise of conversations and laughter filled the air until my uncle's voice suddenly cut through it all like a knife. "You know what the problem is with this generation," he said loudly, turning his head to look directly at me from across the room. "They live off the family for years and years and never learn to stand on their own 2 feet." Every single conversation in the room stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned toward me from every direction, and I could feel dozens of eyes landing on me all at once. I saw judgment flash across some faces, pity and discomfort spread across others. My chest tightened painfully as the room fell into uncomfortable, heavy silence. This was the man who practically raised me, the one who'd been there consistently when my parents worked double shifts and couldn't pick me up from school, the one who told everyone at every single family gathering how incredibly proud he was of me and everything I'd accomplished. Now he was standing there calling me a freeloader in front of everyone we knew, every person whose opinion mattered to me. I felt my face flush hot with deep humiliation and complete confusion about what I could possibly have done to deserve this kind of public attack from someone I loved and trusted with everything. The weight of every stare pressed down on me until I could barely breathe. Hearing those specific words from him hurt more than anything I'd ever experienced in my entire life. This wasn't some distant relative I barely knew offering an unwanted opinion about my life choices or my financial situation. This was the man who used to brag about me constantly to his friends at summer barbecues, who always introduced me as practically my own kid. Whenever we ran into someone he knew at the grocery store or around town, who made me feel genuinely valued and important during the difficult years when I was growing up and struggling to find my place in the world. Now he was deliberately painting me as someone who took everything from everyone and never gave anything back, someone who was nothing more than a burden on the people who loved him most. I left the party early with my chest so tight I could barely take a full breath without pain shooting through my ribs. I sat alone in my car in the driveway for at least 20 minutes before I could even start the engine and drive home safely. I kept replaying his exact words over and over in my head, searching desperately for some context I'd somehow missed, some inside joke I didn't understand, some reasonable explanation for why this was happening to me now. But there was absolutely no misunderstanding I could find no matter how hard I looked. He meant every single word he'd said, and everyone in that crowded room had heard it clearly and would remember it forever. The humiliation felt like it would never fade. 2 days later, my parents called me in the evening just as I was finishing dinner alone at my kitchen table. They didn't ask how I was doing emotionally after what had happened at the party. They didn't mention the humiliation I'd endured in front of the entire extended family or whether I was okay. Instead, my mom asked quietly and very carefully if my finances were currently stable and if I needed help getting back on track with things. I realized with a horrible sinking feeling in my stomach that they completely and totally believed his version of events without question or hesitation. My dad mentioned thoughtfully that my uncle had always been pretty sharp about these kinds of things and that maybe I should seriously take his advice and make some real changes in how you're living. Their voices were gentle and concerned, but also cautious and measured, like they were talking to someone who deeply disappointed them and needed firm correction. His opinion had always carried enormous weight in our family for as long as I could possibly remember. He was the successful one, the responsible one, the person everyone automatically turned to when they needed guidance or advice about anything important in their lives. And now his voice and his influence were turned against me like a weapon, and not a single person in the family was questioning whether what he said was actually true or based on any real facts at all. I felt completely alone in a way I'd never experienced before, isolated from the people who were supposed to know me best. That night around 10 o'clock, my phone buzzed loudly with a text message from him that lit up my dark bedroom. "Someone had to tell you the truth. You'll thank me later when you finally get your life together and start acting like an adult." The tone was incredibly smug and almost parental in nature, like he'd done me some kind of enormous favor by humiliating me in public in front of everyone I cared about most in the world. It felt like complete emotional whiplash coming from someone I'd trusted my entire life without question. This was the exact same man who'd driven me to school on countless mornings when I missed the bus, who'd helped me move heavy furniture into my first apartment when I had no one else to call for help, who'd loaned me his truck without hesitation when mine broke down and I desperately needed to get to work on time. Now he was treating me like an irresponsible child who needed to be publicly corrected and shamed in front of an audience just to learn some kind of harsh lesson about life. I stared at the glowing message on my screen for a very long time, reading it over and over, before finally putting my phone face down on the table because I couldn't stand to look at those words anymore. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined possible from someone who was supposed to care about me. A week later, my cousin Ashley called to uninvite me from her upcoming engagement party that I'd been looking forward to attending. She was apologetic, but frustratingly vague about her reasons for the sudden change in plans. "It's just going to be a small thing now," she explained awkwardly, even though I knew from social media posts I'd seen that she'd invited at least 50 people to the elaborate event at a fancy venue downtown. Other relatives suddenly became noticeably distant and stiff whenever I tried to reach out to them to make plans or just catch up. Group chats I'd been an active part of for years went completely quiet and dead whenever I posted anything at all, like I'd suddenly become invisible to everyone or like I carried some kind of disease. The family hierarchy my uncle had once actively shielded me from when I was younger was now completely aligned against me in every possible way. I wasn't just embarrassed anymore about what had happened at the party. I was being quietly and systematically erased from the entire family structure. And he was the one holding the eraser and actively deciding who stayed and who disappeared from the family circle forever. The isolation felt suffocating, like walls were closing in around me from every direction. At work during the following days and weeks, I struggled badly to concentrate on even the simplest tasks that normally came easily to me. My mind kept drifting back constantly to old memories that now felt completely contaminated and poisoned by what he'd said about me in front of everyone. I remembered vividly all the nights he'd fed me dinner at his house when my parents worked late shifts and couldn't get home in time to cook for me. The countless times he'd patiently helped me with difficult homework assignments at his kitchen table while explaining things I didn't understand. The way he'd always told me with such strong conviction to stand on your own 2 feet and never depend on anyone for anything. Those specific memories used to comfort me deeply when things got hard in my life and I felt alone. They used to make me feel genuinely loved and supported by someone who cared about my well-being. Now they felt like elaborate lies I'd been telling myself for years. How could the man who taught me so much about independence and self-reliance be the exact same person who was now tearing me down publicly for trying to live independently? Nothing about the entire situation made any sense anymore, and the constant confusion was absolutely exhausting, both mentally and emotionally. I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about our relationship and whether any of it had been real. I decided to call him directly on the phone, thinking maybe there was some terrible misunderstanding I could clear up if we just talked honestly face to face. He answered on the third ring, sounding distracted and slightly annoyed that I was calling him at all. I asked him as calmly as I could manage why he'd said those specific things at the party, why he genuinely thought I was living off the family when I'd been supporting myself completely for years now. He sighed heavily and dramatically like I was wasting his valuable time with stupid questions that didn't deserve answers. "You're too sensitive about everything," he said flatly and without any emotion in his voice whatsoever. "Someone needed to say it out loud, and everyone else is just too polite to tell you the real truth about yourself." The coldness in his voice felt like I was talking to a complete stranger instead of someone who'd helped raise me for years. I tried desperately to explain that I'd been supporting myself financially for years and paying all my own bills on time every single month, but he cut me off harshly before I could finish my sentence. "Sure you have," he said sarcastically with obvious disbelief dripping from his tone, and then he just hung up the phone without saying goodbye. I sat there holding my phone in stunned silence, completely unable to process what had just happened between us. The conversation left me feeling more lost and confused than before. The following week, My landlord informed me that my rent was going up by $200 starting next month due to property tax increases in the area. I sat down at my kitchen table to carefully review my entire budget and make the necessary adjustments to accommodate the increase without going into debt. As I scanned through my bank statements line by line, something suddenly caught my eye that I'd never really thought about carefully before: a monthly automatic transfer I'd been making for years without question. $500 exactly, sent on the first of every month like clockwork, directly to my uncle's bank account. He'd asked me to help him out a few years back during what he described as a difficult time financially, carefully framing it as temporary help, while he dealt with some unexpected expenses he didn't want to discuss in detail with anyone. I'd never questioned it even once, because he was family and I trusted him completely. He'd done so much for me when I was growing up and needed someone to depend on. It felt like the absolute least I could do to pay him back for essentially raising me when my parents couldn't always be there for me the way I needed them to be. Looking at the transfer now with fresh eyes, I started to wonder if there was more to the story than he'd told me. I looked at the complete transfer history more closely, scrolling back through months and years of identical payments that never varied by even a single dollar. The requests had started small and apologetic, accompanied by guilt-laden messages like, "After everything I've done for you over the years, I really hate to ask for anything at all." Then gradually over time, they became routine and expected, just another monthly bill I paid automatically without thinking about it at all or questioning where the money was really going. I remembered clearly how he'd get noticeably short and irritated with me if I forgot to send the payment on time, how he'd remind me in extensive detail of all the sacrifices he'd made for me when I was younger and couldn't take care of myself properly. At the time, it had felt like completely normal family obligation, the kind of thing you just do for people who helped you when you needed it most. But sitting there at my kitchen table, with my budget spreadsheet open in front of me, something about the pattern suddenly felt deeply and fundamentally wrong to me. Affection mixed carefully with guilt and obligation. Gratitude weaponized and turned into something darker and more manipulative. I tried to push the uncomfortable thought away, feeling disloyal for even thinking it about someone I loved and respected so much. But the doubt had been planted, and it wouldn't go away no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. A few days later, a letter showed up in my mailbox that was clearly addressed to him instead of me. It must have been misdelivered by the postal carrier. He lived just 3 blocks away from me, and sometimes the mail carrier got our addresses confused because the house numbers were similar and easy to mix up. I opened it without really thinking about privacy concerns, just assuming it might be something important I should bring over to him right away. My stomach dropped hard when I saw the official bank letterhead printed across the top of the page in bold letters. It was a detailed mortgage statement with his full name on it. I scanned the page quickly with shaking hands, my eyes catching and then freezing completely on the payment amount listed at the very bottom of the document. $500 exactly, due on the first of every single month, without exception. My hands started shaking badly before my brain had even fully processed what I was actually looking at and what it meant for me and our relationship. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I immediately pulled up my bank history on my laptop and compared it carefully to the mortgage statement I was holding in my trembling hands. The amounts matched absolutely perfectly down to the penny. Every single transfer I'd made for the past 3 years lined up exactly, dollar for dollar, with his monthly mortgage payments on his house. I hadn't been helping him with temporary expenses like he'd told me repeatedly over the years. I'd been carrying his entire house payment for years without knowing it or consenting to it. He'd never told me the truth about what the money was actually for or where it was going each month. He'd deliberately let me believe I was repaying a debt of gratitude to the man who'd helped raise me, when really I was just covering his bills so he didn't have to pay them himself out of his own pocket. The betrayal felt deeply personal in a way few things in my life ever had before. This wasn't some stranger on the internet scamming me out of money through some elaborate scheme. This was family. This was the man I'd trusted more than almost anyone else in the entire world, and he'd been using me the whole time without any guilt or hesitation. I felt sick to my stomach as the full scope of what he'd done started to sink in. I started digging frantically through old messages between us on my phone, reading everything with completely new eyes and a different perspective. Every single emergency he'd mentioned to me over the years lined up perfectly with overdue mortgage notices I found in an old cardboard box he'd left at my apartment months ago and never bothered to pick up. Things are really tight this month and I need help. Unexpected expense came up that I didn't plan for in my budget. Could really use your help if you can manage it right now. He'd never once been honest with me about what the money was actually for or where it was going each month. He'd carefully manipulated me with guilt and affection, keeping me locked into payments I didn't even fully understand I was making on his behalf. And then, after years of quietly using me to keep his house and maintain his lifestyle, he'd stood in front of my entire family at a crowded party and called me a freeloader who never contributed anything to anyone. The sheer cruelty of it made my chest physically ache with pain and confusion. How could someone who claimed to care about me do something so deliberately hurtful and manipulative? I didn't understand how the person I'd trusted most could betray me so completely. I completely broke down in my car after work one evening, just sitting alone in the parking lot with the engine turned off and my head pressed against the steering wheel. He'd turned me into the family embarrassment after quietly using my income to keep himself financially afloat for years without anyone knowing what he was doing. The man who'd once protected me from bullies at school when I was being picked on, who'd made me feel safe and valued when I was young and vulnerable and didn't have many friends, was now actively destroying my reputation to cover his own tracks and hide his own failures from everyone. I didn't know if he was deflecting his own guilt or punishing me for something I didn't understand or couldn't see clearly. I just knew that the person I'd trusted most in the entire world had betrayed me in the deepest way possible, and I genuinely didn't know how to come back from that kind of betrayal, or if it was even possible to rebuild any kind of relationship after this. The tears came suddenly, and I couldn't stop them, all the pain and confusion and anger pouring out of me in that empty parking lot where no one could see me fall apart. I stopped responding to family messages completely and ignored all the notifications that kept popping up on my phone. I pulled away from group chats and politely declined every single invitation to gatherings and events that came my way over the following weeks. I needed real space to process everything without having to perform normalcy for people who'd already judged and convicted me without trial or evidence. I carefully saved every bank statement, every mortgage notice, every text message where he'd asked me for money over the years in a folder on my computer that I backed up multiple times. I wasn't planning revenge or some dramatic confrontation. I wasn't even completely sure what I was planning to do with all of it yet. I just knew I desperately needed to protect myself from more emotional damage, and documentation felt like the only real control I had left over the situation spiraling around me. The evidence gave me something concrete to hold on to when everything else felt like it was falling apart. 2 weeks later, my uncle messaged me again like nothing had happened between us at all. "Don't forget the usual transfer," he wrote casually, as if we were still on good terms and everything was normal. "Bills don't stop just because you're mad at me about something." Then, just a few minutes later, another message appeared on my screen that made my blood boil with anger. "Don't forget who was there for you when absolutely no one else was in your corner." The manipulation felt blatant and obvious now, almost insulting in how transparent it was to me now that I knew the truth. He genuinely believed he could still guilt me into continuing to pay his mortgage after humiliating me in public in front of everyone I knew and cared about. The sheer audacity of it would have been almost impressive if it wasn't so deeply infuriating and hurtful. I didn't respond to either message at all. I just stared at my phone screen until it went completely dark and the notifications disappeared. Part of me wanted to confront him immediately, but another part of me knew I needed to be strategic about this. My parents called a few days later, sounding genuinely concerned about the family dynamics and the tension everyone could feel. They asked carefully why my uncle seemed so irritated with me lately and if we'd had some kind of serious falling out that they should know about or get involved in to mediate. I told them honestly it was complicated and that I didn't want to talk about it yet because I was still processing everything that had happened. They didn't press me for details or push me to explain everything right away, but I could hear the clear unease in both their voices over the phone. He'd been their trusted voice and advisor for decades of their lives. They couldn't even imagine him doing anything seriously wrong to anyone, especially not to me. And I wasn't emotionally ready to shatter that image for them yet. Not yet anyway. Not until I fully understood the complete scope of what he'd done to me over the years and had all my evidence organized. I knew that when I finally told them the truth, I needed to have everything documented clearly so there would be no room for doubt or misinterpretation. He started leaving voicemails on my phone that I couldn't bring myself to delete immediately. At first, they were annoyed and demanding, reminding me sharply about responsibilities and commitments I'd made to him that couldn't be broken under any circumstances. Then they gradually became panicked and desperate sounding, his voice cracking slightly with what sounded like genuine fear. He mentioned overdue deadlines, accumulating late fees, people calling him constantly about missed payments on various things. Without my monthly transfers propping him up financially, his entire financial situation was clearly unraveling fast and spiraling out of control. For the first time in our entire relationship, I clearly saw how completely dependent he'd been on me all along. How much of his stability and comfortable lifestyle had rested entirely on my guilt and loyalty to him. It didn't make me feel powerful or vindicated at all. It just made me feel sad and angry at exactly the same time in equal measures. I wondered how long he'd planned to keep this going and what would have happened if I'd never found out the truth about where my money was really going. I made my final decision quietly and deliberately after a sleepless night spent staring at my ceiling. I stopped all transfers completely, switched to a new bank across town, and carefully filed away every single piece of documentation I had collected over the weeks in a safe place where I could access it easily. I wasn't planning some dramatic confrontation or public revenge at all. I just desperately needed boundaries for the first time in my adult life with him. I needed to stop letting him dictate my worth and my obligations to the family. I needed to protect myself emotionally and financially, even if it meant disappointing the person who'd helped raise me when I was young. Even if it meant accepting that the man I'd looked up to my entire life wasn't actually who I'd always thought he was in my mind. The decision felt both liberating and terrifying at the same time, but I knew it was the right thing to do for myself. Another misdelivered letter arrived in my mailbox exactly a week later. This one was significantly more serious in tone, an official foreclosure warning from the bank. He'd missed multiple payments in a row, and the bank was starting formal legal proceedings against him to take the house. I stared at the letter for a very long time, feeling a complicated mix of emotions I couldn't begin to untangle or name properly. Part of me felt vindicated and justified in my actions to stop the payments. Part of me felt guilty for letting it get this far without saying something to someone. And part of me realized he was desperate enough to lash out again publicly if he felt cornered by circumstances beyond his control. I needed to be completely ready and prepared for whatever came next from him. I knew that desperate people did desperate things, and he'd already shown he was willing to humiliate me publicly to get what he wanted. I heard through my cousin Ashley that there was a big holiday dinner coming up in just a few weeks. Everyone would be there, parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, the entire extended family gathering together in one place for the first time in months. I knew my uncle would definitely be there too, and I knew with absolute certainty he'd try to control the narrative again about me and what was happening between us. He'd paint me as ungrateful, as someone who'd turned his back on family when things got difficult for everyone, but I was completely done being blindsided by his attacks and accusations. I was done letting him tell my story for me to everyone who would listen. I decided firmly that I'd go to the dinner no matter how uncomfortable it would be, and this time I'd be ready for whatever he tried to pull. I spent the next few days organizing all my documentation, making sure everything was clear and easy to understand for people who weren't familiar with the situation. I walked into the house on the night of the dinner feeling strangely calm and centered in a way I hadn't expected at all. The anxiety I'd been anticipating never actually came to me. I greeted people politely, poured myself a drink from the kitchen, and waited patiently for what I knew was coming eventually. My uncle spotted me across the crowded room and gave me a tight, completely fake smile that didn't reach his eyes at all. Then, just like at the birthday party weeks before, he deliberately raised his voice so everyone in the house could hear him clearly over the noise. "Nice of you to show up tonight," he said with obvious sarcasm dripping from every word he spoke. "Even after ignoring all your responsibilities and turning your back on the man who was practically your second father for years." People looked uncomfortable and shifted awkwardly in their seats, but no one said anything in my defense at all. I just stood there calmly and let him talk and dig his own grave deeper with every word. He kept going relentlessly, his voice getting progressively louder and more indignant with each sentence he spoke to the room. "Go ahead," he said dramatically, gesturing toward me with his drink in hand for everyone to see clearly. "Tell everyone the truth right now. Tell them exactly why you've been avoiding me for weeks. Tell them why you stopped helping family when we needed you most." The entire room went completely quiet and still, everyone watching us both intently. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder I'd brought specifically for this moment. I walked calmly over to the dining table and placed the mortgage statements, bank transfers, and misdelivered letters in a neat stack where everyone could see them clearly. Then I looked directly at him and said quietly but clearly enough for everyone to hear, "I didn't turn my back on you at all. You've been using me to pay your mortgage for 3 years without telling me what the money was really for. And then you called me a freeloader in front of everyone to cover it up and make yourself look better." He froze completely in place like a statue, his face going pale. His mouth opened slowly, but nothing came out at first as he processed what I'd just said in front of everyone. Relatives leaned in from all sides to look at the documents I'd laid out on the table, their faces shifting rapidly from confusion to shock to disgust as they read through everything carefully. My aunt picked up one of the statements and compared it directly to a bank transfer printout, her eyes widening in disbelief at what she was seeing. "This is real," she said quietly but clearly enough for everyone around to hear her words. "The man who'd raised me, the family's reliable moral authority for decades, was exposed as someone who'd exploited me for years while publicly shamming me to hide his own actions from everyone." Conversations shifted throughout the room dramatically. People stopped looking at me and started looking at him instead with very different expressions on their faces. He stammered something weak about misunderstandings and taking things out of context, but absolutely no one was listening to him anymore at all. His credibility was completely gone in an instant, shattered beyond repair. I watched as the reality of what he'd done sank in for everyone in the room. My parents pulled me aside immediately after dinner, their faces pale and horrified by what they'd learned tonight about someone they'd trusted for so long. "We had no idea this was happening to you," my mom said, her voice shaking badly with emotion and shock. "We are so sorry we didn't believe you when you tried to tell us something was wrong." My dad looked like he'd aged 10 years in one single night from the revelation of what had been going on. Other relatives who'd avoided me completely at the engagement party now avoided him instead wherever he went in the house. The weight of years of obligation, guilt, and manipulation finally lifted off my shoulders all at once, like a physical burden being removed. I didn't feel triumphant or victorious about any of it happening the way it did. I just felt exhausted and sad about how everything had turned out with someone I loved and trusted. But I also felt lighter than I had in years, like I could finally breathe properly again without that constant pressure on my chest. My parents hugged me tightly and promised they'd support me through whatever came next. A few weeks later, word spread quickly through the family grapevine that he'd moved out of his house after the bank finally foreclosed on the property he'd been struggling to keep. He'd missed too many payments after I stopped covering them each month, and the bank finally took action against him according to their policies. Some relatives felt bad for him and his situation despite everything that had happened. Others were still angry about what he'd done to me over the years and how he'd manipulated me. I felt a complicated mix of sadness and relief that I couldn't fully explain to anyone who asked me about it. I didn't reach out to him at all after the dinner. I didn't gloat about what happened to him or tell people they should cut him off. I just focused entirely on rebuilding my own life from scratch, on paying my own bills, setting my own boundaries with people who tried to take advantage, and finally living without the shadow of someone who'd raised me but never truly let me go or treated me as an equal adult who deserved respect. For the first time in years, my life felt like it was actually my own to live, however, I wanted, without someone else pulling the strings behind the scenes.